A wing that stopped flying under a thin layer of snow. A go-around started 3 seconds too late. One airliner, sold to every corner of the world, and every time the thing that failed was working exactly as designed. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. The two pilots had flown that route in the opposite direction 2 hours earlier and found clear air the whole way. When they came back through Huntsville that afternoon, nobody had told them what the sky over Georgia had been doing since. The National Weather Service had been issuing severe weather warnings for nearly 3 hours. Southern Airways did not subscribe to the service that carried them. It did subscribe to a second one that faxed regional radar printouts, and the fax machine at the local office was not working that day. 9 minutes before departure, a dispatcher rang the weather office in Athens, Georgia, and got a busy line. Nobody tried another number. Flight 242 left Huntsville, Alabama just before 4 in the afternoon on the 4th of April 1977 with a forecast that was hours out of date. It carried 81 passengers and 4 crew, climbing to 17,000 feet on a straight line toward a radio beacon at Rome, Georgia. The whole trip was meant to take 25 minutes. 2 minutes out, the weather radar picked up a solid line of storms ahead. The display was black and white, and to judge intensity, a pilot switched to a mode where the heaviest rain showed as a dark patch inside the white return. The heaviest rain and empty air looked much the same on it. The set also worked on a short wavelength that heavy rain absorbs. With enough water close to the nose, the beam never reaches what lies beyond it and nothing comes back. So the screen shows a clear space exactly where the storm is worst. Both pilots looked at that display and saw a gap. They flew into it. A rain gauge at Rome recorded 1.2 inches in 10 minutes while the airplane was overhead. Hail broke the windshield and dented the inlet rings on both engines. Air traffic control cleared them down to 14,000 feet, and the first officer brought the engines back to idle. An engine at idle takes in far less air than its intake sweeps up, because a pressure wave builds in front and pushes the surplus around the outside. Water carries too much momentum to be pushed anywhere and goes straight in. So, at idle, the engines were swallowing the same water inside a fraction of the air. Their rotation fell below what the generators needed, and the airplane went dark. Cabin lights, instruments, and both recorders stopped for 36 seconds, until the first officer pushed the throttles up far enough to bring the power back. By then, the water had chilled the front of each compressor enough to put both engines on the edge of a surge, which is airflow reversing direction inside the machine. The way out of a surge is to pull the power back. Air traffic control needed them clear of other traffic and told them to climb to 15,000 feet. The first officer pushed the throttles up a second time. Inside a minute, both engines were beyond saving. No passenger jet had lost power on every engine since jets entered service in 1952. The controller offered them Dobbins, a military field with a long runway closer than Atlanta. Then the electrical system failed again, and the recorders stopped for 124 seconds. In that time, the airplane turned 180 degrees and went back the way it had come. Investigators never worked out why. The turn put Dobbins out of reach, and the small field at Cartersville with it. When the backup generator brought the radios back, they were at 7,000 feet with 20 miles to run to Dobbins, which was more than the airplane had left in it. They looked for an open field and found forest underneath them. The captain picked out a straight piece of 2-lane road ahead with no cars on it, narrower than the wingspan. The left wing caught trees on the way in, and both wings brought down utility poles along the edges of the road. The gear touched the pavement, and the outer left wing struck an embankment at almost the same moment. The airplane went off the road into a store with fuel pumps outside it, and broke apart across the fields beyond. 63 people on the airplane were lost, and 9 more on the ground, 7 of them from one family in cars outside the store. 22 survived. The 2 flight attendants had been preparing the cabin for a crash landing from the moment the engines quit, with no word of instruction from the cockpit. Investigators wrote afterwards that the toll would have been higher without them. Engines now have to pass a water ingestion test that simulates rain at 30 inches an hour before anyone will certify them. And after that turn, with both airports behind them, there had been a third one inside their glide. A general aviation field near Rockmart had a 4,000-foot runway, long enough to take a DC-9. It was missing from the pilot's charts because nobody expected an airliner there, and it fell outside the controller's sector, so it was missing from his as well. One of the passengers on board knew it was there. There were 2 captains in the cockpit. The one in the left seat had command that day. The one in the right seat was senior to him and was a check airman, one of the pilots the company used to examine the others. They were working a 2-day pairing and swapping seats each day. So on the leg to Atlanta, the junior man was in charge. Both had been made captain on the DC-9 after 500 or 600 hours on the type. At the larger American airlines, the figure was closer to 10 times that. Midwest Express had started life as Kimberly-Clark's corporate flight department and opened to the public in 1984, still owned by the paper company. It flew 3 DC-9s from the 1960s, and the one working that afternoon had close to 49,000 flights behind it. 6 of the 27 passengers worked for Kimberly-Clark, and one of them was in the jump seat behind the pilots. The airline had an unwritten rule its pilots called the silent cockpit. If something went wrong after decision speed and below 800 feet, nobody was to discuss it. The job was to fly the airplane, and the conversation could wait. The rule discouraged even calling out what had failed. It was taught in training, and it contradicted the airline's own operations manual, which told the first officer to scan his instruments and tell the captain about any malfunction he found. Somewhere in the 1970s, a crack started in a metal ring inside the right engine, one of the spacers that hold the compressor discs apart. In 1981, the engine went to a shop in Miami for overhaul, and the shop checked the spacers with fluorescent dye. The crack was there, and it should have shown up, and nobody found it. There was no record that the man doing the inspecting had ever had the annual eye examinations his job required. The engine went back together with the crack inside it, where nothing could reach it until the next overhaul. It ran for 4 more years. On the 6th of September 1985, the airplane left Milwaukee for Atlanta, off runway 19 right with 27 passengers and 4 crew. At 450 feet, the spacer let go and took compressor blades out with it. There was a clunk and the nose swung slightly to the right. The captain put in left rudder, which is exactly the correct response. He asked what that was and got no answer. 2 seconds later, he asked again, by name, and got no answer again. Then he took the left rudder out and pushed the right pedal instead. Nearly every engine failure he had practiced in a simulator had happened on the runway, past decision speed, but before the wheels left the ground, where the centerline swings across the windscreen and shows a pilot which way the airplane is going. This one came at 450 feet, with the nose 12 degrees up and nothing ahead but sky. The left engine had lost a little thrust as well, so its gauge needle was moving while the right one sat still at 0. The first officer, meanwhile, told the tower they had an emergency. He did not say what kind. He was on the radio, so he had not been knocked out. He had used the word emergency himself, so he knew something was wrong. The recorder shows he heard both of the captain's questions. The controller who took that call could see smoke and flame coming off the right engine, and pieces of the airplane falling away behind it. He gave them a heading to turn onto and said nothing about any of it. The yaw went far enough that the right wing stopped flying and dropped. Instead of rolling out of it, the captain pulled back on the control column. A wing in a steep turn stalls at a much higher speed than it does in level flight, and this one reached that speed almost at once. The right wing went first. The airplane rolled onto its back, and it corkscrewed into a wildlife preserve just past the end of the field. 15 seconds had passed since the clunk, and all 31 people on board were lost. Investigators found no debris damage to the flight controls, and the thrust lost on one side could not by itself have produced that much yaw. The safety board looked at how a DC-9 behaves after that kind of failure on takeoff, and found it docile and easily controllable by an ordinary pilot. The airline's chief pilot defended the silent cockpit at the hearing. The board called it dangerous and said it probably broke federal regulations. The regulator's inspector for Midwest Express had never flown for an airline, had no jet experience, and knew very little about the DC-9. She came from light aviation and spent most of her time on small aircraft around Milwaukee. Anything to do with the airline she passed to inspectors elsewhere. At the hearing, she said she did not know what its engine failure procedure was, or that its pilots were being taught to say nothing. She also said she had been uncomfortable with the appointment because she was not qualified for it. Instructors who taught on the DC-9 told the board that about one line pilot in 50 pushed the wrong rudder pedal when they simulated an engine failure in recurrent training. The captain had 33 hours as a DC-9 captain. The first officer had 36 hours in a DC-9 altogether, and it was the only jet he had ever flown. Neither of them had flown the type in snow. Continental had hired the first officer 4 months earlier on the strength of a background check it bought from an outside firm, which reported that his previous performance had been very good. The record said otherwise. One regional airline let him go after he failed 3 check rides. He failed a license examination at the next one. In Continental's own training, he made jerky control inputs and struggled to hold a speed. And in a simulator, he once let the airplane roll to 60 degrees of bank before an instructor took it off him. No American airline was then required to look at what a pilot's previous employers had written about him. He had not flown at all in 24 days. Continental's chief pilot put him on this trip to keep his qualification from lapsing. The captain had over 12,000 hours, most of them in business jets, and had moved onto the DC-9 in April. Because he had under 100 hours in the left seat, he was held to higher visibility limits for landing than other captains, which meant that in the weather over Denver that afternoon, he could not have come back if he had needed to. He did not mention it to the dispatcher. A flight attendant asked him who would be landing at Denver on the way home, in a snowstorm, with a first officer this new. The captain said he would take that leg himself. Under the usual arrangement of alternating legs, that handed the first officer the takeoff. They de-iced out on a pad away from the terminal, hot glycol and water over the wings, and they finished at 1:45. That solution strips off what is already there and does very little to stop more arriving. Continental's rules said an airplane that had not taken off within 20 minutes had to come back and do it again. They never went back because they were sitting in a queue that nobody on the ground knew they were in. The crew had left the gate without asking ground control for permission, so the tower's paper strip still had them parked at the terminal. For several minutes, the controller called a different Continental flight, an MD-80, which he believed was the one waiting at the head of the runway. That airplane was still at the de-icing pad with its engines shut down and nobody listening. From behind, the two types look much the same. He eventually told another Continental jet to taxi around the one in front and take the runway instead. By the time the first officer got on the radio and explained who they actually were, 21 minutes had gone since the fluid went on. They were next in line, so they stayed where they were. They rolled at 2:15, 27 minutes after de-icing, in wet snow with the air 2 degrees below freezing. The falling snow had watered down the glycol until it froze again, and the layer that formed was rough and thinner than a millimeter. A DC-9 wing is swept back and carries no slats along its leading edge to help it at high angles. Ice of that thickness takes about 1/5 of the lift out of it and drops the angle at which the wing stops flying from around 14 degrees to under 12. The captain called the speed and told him to rotate at 139 knots. The first officer pulled the nose up at 6 degrees a second, twice the normal rate, and took the airplane past 12 degrees with the wheels still on the runway. The wing quit below the angle the stall warning is set for, so no warning sounded. Neither pilot knew what was happening to them. It came off the ground, sank back, ran off the right side of the runway and put its left wing into the snow. The wing tore away and the DC-9 rolled onto its back. With the airplane on its back, the exit in the tail now opened into the ground, and the people in that section did not get out for 7 to 10 minutes. The last survivor came out almost 4 hours after the crash, once crews had propped the upturned wing with cranes and a forklift to stop it settling on the rescuers underneath. 28 of the 82 people on board were lost, 19 at the moment of impact, and 9 more trapped where nobody could reach them in time. Both pilots and the forward flight attendant were among them. Continental told the investigation that its airplane had been knocked down by the wake of a 767 that landed on the parallel runway 3 minutes earlier. The safety board worked through the wind and the distance and did not accept it. The captain of the jet that taxied around them said he had seen nothing on their wings. Several of the surviving passengers said they had seen ice on the engine inlets and in patches on the wing after the de-icing. Europe was already using a thicker de-icing fluid that keeps working for hours instead of minutes. The European Airline Association had published a full specification for it in 1986, which set out the fluid, the equipment to spray it, and the way to put it on. The American circular on de-icing did not mention it, and almost no airport in the United States could have sprayed it anyway. Investigators concluded that with that fluid on its wings, Flight 1713 would almost certainly have got away. The tickets went in a few hours. There were not many flights down to Sicily in those days, and the one leaving Rome late on the 22nd of December 1978 meant Christmas at home. It was a DC-9 named Isola di Stromboli, carrying 124 passengers and 5 crew. Palermo's airport at Punta Raisi had taken lives before. On the 5th of May 1972, an Alitalia flight coming down from Rome lost its alignment and went into Montagna Longa, a hill a few kilometers from the field. All 115 people aboard were lost, and it remained the worst accident in Italian civil aviation for nearly 30 years. Pilots started calling Punta Raisi the trap of Europe. The inquiry into it found the airport had no approach radar and no rotating beacon. The state voted the money to install both, and 6 years later the airport still had neither. The DC-9 came in after midnight, onto runway 21, with a southwesterly wind gusting to 30 knots. The approach worked against a radio beacon with a distance readout, and it stepped the airplane down to set heights at set ranges. The crew flew it on instruments until they were about 2 miles out. Then they stopped descending at 150 feet above the water and took over by hand to look for the runway ahead. They believed they were closer in than they were. Pilots who went over it afterwards put that down to the runway lights reflecting off the cloud and off the sea, which would have placed the runway a few hundred meters nearer than it really was. Several items on the approach checklist went unread. They carried on below the height the procedure allowed them. Investigators could not rule out a failure in the instruments. One or more of the altimeters may have gone wrong, while the flag that is supposed to warn of exactly that showed nothing at all. Douglas and the instrument maker had written to Alitalia in 1975 to say those flags could do it. For the last 9 seconds, the airplane flew almost level with the sea at 150 knots. Then the wind took away what height it had left, and the right wing went into the water. It broke apart about 2 miles north of the runway, off the coast at Sinisi, and the pieces went down quickly into a dark and moving sea. All 5 of the crew were lost, and so were 103 of the passengers. 21 people got out and swam for the shore. Fishermen at Terra had watched the airplane go into the water and came out in their boats to pick them up. 17 of the dead were never recovered. 3 inquiries followed. The prosecutor in Palermo ran a criminal one. The Transport Ministry ran its own, and Alitalia ran a third. There were questions in Parliament. Investigators placed airport directors under scrutiny, along with the officers on duty that night and officials from the aviation and air navigation authorities. Nobody was convicted. The technical report came in within the year and found that no written rule had been broken. Italy had not yet put the international standards on radar and airfield lighting into its own law, so an airport without them was operating legally. An Argentine airliner came down on a cattle ranch in Uruguay. It remains the worst air accident in the history of Argentina and the worst in the history of Uruguay. Flight 2553 left Posadas at 9:20 on the evening of the 10th of October 1997, bound for Buenos Aires, with 69 passengers and 5 crew on a DC-9 that was 28 years old. The route down runs close to the Uruguayan border, and that night it took them across it. The first officer was flying. The captain had the radio and the instruments in front of him. They leveled at 35,000 feet and went into a line of thunderstorms, with cumulonimbus building around them and the air far below freezing. The speed an airplane shows its pilots comes from a small tube facing into the airflow. Air pushes into the open end. The instruments measure how hard, and that becomes the number on the dial. Ice in the opening weakens it, so the number drops while the airplane carries on at whatever speed it was already doing. Nobody had switched on the heaters that keep those tubes clear, and there was nothing on the panel to tell anybody that. The speed on the dial started dropping. The crew took out the autopilot and began feeding in power to hold it up. They asked to go down and got no reply, so they went down anyway to build the speed back. On the way, the captain worked out that the reading was wrong and called for it to stop. Then the slats came out. Slats are the panels along the front of a wing that let an airplane fly slowly without falling out of the sky, and every type has a speed above which they must not be extended. The DC-9 was a long way past it. It went out of control and hit a ranch near Nuevo, Berlin, about 20 miles from Fray Bentos, at more than 1,200 kilometers an hour. It left a crater. All 74 people on board were lost. The commission that led the investigation was Uruguayan. It found that the crash followed a wrong decision on the flight deck, and it put that decision down to the frozen tubes, the missing warning and training that had never covered any of this. The criminal case went to court in Argentina, where the Air Force regulated civil aviation at the time, and it began with the family of one of the flight attendants who died. More than 30 people ended up in the dock, among them former Air Force officers and former Austral executives. The charge rested on an alarm the airplane should have carried and did not, one that would have told the crew the pitot heating was off. The families asked for sentences of 12 to 25 years. The prosecutor asked for acquittals, and 24 years after the crash, the court let every one of them go. Argentina never accepted the Uruguayan finding either. Its own investigators said at the time, and a technical review has said since, that the airplane really was slowing down, and the instrument was telling the truth. On that reading, the engines were producing less thrust than their gauges showed, because ice crystals high in the storm had blocked the sensors at their intakes. Nobody had described that phenomenon in 1997. Almost 30 years later, the two countries still do not agree on what happened to Flight 2553. The approach chart gave altitudes above sea level, printed in larger and bolder type than the second set of figures beside them. Eastern Airlines had its pilots set their main altimeter to read height above the airfield instead. Charlotte's touchdown zone sits at 726 feet, So every number on the chart and every number on the instrument stood that far apart. A crew flying in had to carry both in their heads. The altimeters were the drum and pointer type. Hundreds of feet came off a large dial with a needle, thousands off a small drum set into the face. Reading one takes two separate looks, and the drum is the easier part to skip. Flight 212 left Charleston, South Carolina at 7 in the morning on the 11th of September 1974, bound for Charlotte in North Carolina, with 78 passengers and 4 crew on board. The recorded weather gave a mile and a half of visibility in patchy ground fog, so they would be flying an instrument approach to runway 36. It was a beacon and distance approach. The last fix before the runway was called Ross, 5 miles out from the beacon on the field and 4 from the threshold. The chart said to cross it at 1,800 feet, which on their own instruments was 1,074. After Ross, they could descend to 394 feet above the field and no lower without seeing the runway. On the way down, the two pilots talked about whether Nixon should be pardoned, then about the oil crisis, then about how many cars each of them owned. Then the captain saw a tower standing out of the fog and said it was the one at the Carowinds amusement park. The first officer was not sure. The captain changed his mind and then changed it back. The exchange ran for 35 seconds and 12 separate remarks. The airplane went through 1,800 feet in the middle of it more than 2 miles before the fix, doing 186 knots. A tone came on to tell them they were 1,000 feet above the ground. It ran off the radio altimeter and every flight got it at that height. Somebody reached up and shut it off. The captain read the crossing figure for Ross off his chart, 1,800 feet, which was the sea level number. A moment later, one of them said 394, and the other acknowledged it, which was the figure for the minimum. Neither of them said where the airplane actually was. The first officer told the inquiry afterwards that the pointer on his altimeter had sat between the 6 and the 7, and that he believed he was about 130 feet low. Investigators thought he had seen 670, never looked at the small drum, and taken it for 1,670, with the captain's number still in his ear. The board wrote that this was speculation on its part. They crossed Ross at 1,350 feet. That is 624 above the field and 450 below where they should have been, at 168 knots against a target of 122. Then he set a descent of 800 feet a minute. Eastern taught its pilots to turn speed and distance into a time to the runway, then divide their height above the field by it. For an airplane at 1,670 feet, 800 feet a minute is the correct answer. From 670, it pointed them at the ground. The tower cleared them to land. 5 flights had already come down on runway 36 that morning without trouble, but each of them was higher and closer in when it entered the fog, with less of it between the cockpit and the lights. 7 or 8 seconds after the fog closed around them, the DC-9 struck trees. It came down 3.3 miles short of the threshold and about 100 feet below the airport, and the wreckage ran 995 feet through a field and into the wood beyond. 72 of the 82 people on board were lost, 32 of them at the moment of impact and the rest in the fire. The forward flight attendant, 1 passenger, and the first officer got out through the sliding window on the captain's side. Among the passengers were the father and 2 brothers of Stephen Colbert, who was 10 years old. Eastern required the pilot not flying to call the altitude at the final fix, again at 500 feet above the field, and again at 100 feet above the minimum. The captain made none of the 3. On the 8th of October, less than a month after the crash, and 7 months before its own report was finished, the safety board wrote to the regulator and asked it to do something about professional standards on the flight deck. It cited 5 earlier approach accidents alongside this one. The rule that eventually came out of that request arrived in 1981, and it bars an American flight crew from doing anything unrelated to operating the airplane below 10,000 feet. By the 1990s, the road between Abuja and Port Harcourt had become dangerous enough that parents stopped putting their children on it. When Sosoliso began flying the route in 2001, families with children at boarding school in Abuja started sending them home by air instead. On the 10th of December, 2005, 61 of those children were aboard Flight 1145, going home to Port Harcourt in Nigeria for the Christmas holiday. There were 103 passengers and 7 crew on the airplane. It was a DC-9 built in 1973. A Yugoslav airline owned it and Sosoliso leased it, and the heavy maintenance went back to Belgrade. It had been on the Nigerian register since 2003, and its airworthiness certificate had 6 days left to run. The captain had 10,050 hours with 1,900 of them on the type. The first officer had 920 hours altogether, of which 670 were on the DC-9, so the airplane was very nearly his entire flying career. 25 miles out, the captain handed him the controls and took the radio. The approach controller read them a weather report that was 42 minutes old. A newer one existed, taken 12 minutes after it, and that one carried thunderstorm cloud in several directions and a thunderstorm trend. The old report was the only detailed weather the crew were ever given. They asked whether it was raining at the field and were told no rain, scattered cloud. 4 minutes later, the controller told them precipitation was moving in from the direction of runway 21 and passed them to the tower. The tower cleared them to land and warned that the runway was slightly wet. Nobody gave them the wind, and nobody asked for it. The wind had been coming down the runway at 9 knots. By the time they were on short final, it had swung round and was blowing from behind them. A sea breeze front, reinforced by outflow from the storms, was crossing the airport. The runway had edge lights and approach lights and a set of approach slope lights. All of them were working, and none of them were on. Port Harcourt ran its airfield lighting at night only, because the main supply was unreliable, and there was no money to keep generators going through the day. The crew flew the approach without asking for them, and the tower said nothing about them. No notice existed to say they were off. A security guard at the navigation beacon a kilometer from the threshold watched them come over. It was dark and raining, he said afterwards, and the approach lights were not on. The airplane did not look steady to him as it went past. The decision altitude for that approach was 307 feet, which is 220 feet above the ground. They leveled off at 204 feet, 117 above the ground, and held it there for 14 seconds with nothing in front of them. Their speed fell below 145 knots. 16 seconds before impact, the captain called for a go-around and asked for gear up and flaps. The flap lever went up while the gear was still down, which is the reverse of the order. A warning horn sounded, and behind it the ground proximity system called out. Power was going on 7 seconds before impact. The DC-9 hit the grass between the runway and the taxiway, 70 meters left of the runway edge, and it was coming down at more than 2,000 feet a minute. 60 meters further on, the rear fuselage struck an exposed concrete drainage culvert. An engine and the rear staircase tore off and stayed there. The airplane broke up and burned along the next 800 meters of ground, and the cockpit was found 300 meters beyond the end of everything else. Fire crews reached it inside a minute. The fire covered more than a kilometer of grass, and the wind was strong enough that they had to move their equipment to work at all. The airport was short of a rapid intervention vehicle and an ambulance and trained people, and nobody had exercised its emergency plan in a long time. They brought 7 people out alive, and 5 of them died in hospital. One of the 2 who lived was Keiichi Okuchi, 16 years old, the only one of the 61 students to come off that airplane. The investigation found nothing in Sosoliso's training records about recognizing wind shear or recovering from it. Afterwards, the parents of the children who did not come home went to the governor of River State and asked him for land, so that the Jesuits could build a school at Port Harcourt, as well as the one in Abuja. He gave them the land and the money to start. It opened in 2013. Douglas built the DC-9 for the places the bigger jets would not go. It was small and strong, and it got in and out of short runways on hot afternoons without asking much of the ground underneath it. Airlines bought it for that and then took it at its word. They sent it into cities whose airports were older than the jet age, onto fields without radar, and into weather nobody on the ground could see properly. Sometimes the airplane is in the finding. The engines that quit over Georgia were certified under rules written before anyone thought to check what a jet does when it swallows a thunderstorm. Outside Denver, ice thinner than a millimeter took a fifth of the lift off an early wing that had nothing along its front edge to help it. And over Uruguay, the slats came out at a speed no slat is built to see, and one of them left the wing. More often, it is barely in the finding at all. The board that examined Milwaukee wrote that a DC-9 after that kind of engine failure is docile and takes no unusual strength or skill to fly, and it meant it. The airplane was fine. The airline had a policy telling one pilot not to speak to the other, and that is what failed. In most of them, the decision that mattered belonged to somebody who was not on board, and often not even there that day. A dispatcher in Alabama picked up a phone 9 minutes before departure, found the line busy and put it down again, and a crew flew into the worst weather of the year on a forecast that was hours old. Somebody at Port Harcourt decided the runway lights would run at night only because there was no money for generators. An inquiry into an earlier crash at Palermo found the airport had no radar and no rotating beacon, and the state voted the money for both. 6 years later, a second airplane came down on the same approach with neither of them fitted. Somebody made every one of those decisions sitting still, with time to think it over. Some of it changed afterwards. Since 1981, an American flight crew below 10,000 feet may not talk about anything that is not the airplane, and that rule exists because of a tower at an amusement park and a chart printed in 2 sizes of type. Other things changed not at all. Nobody was convicted over Palermo, because an Italian airport running without radar in 1978 broke no Italian law. More than 30 people stood trial in Buenos Aires over the airplane that came down in Uruguay, and after 24 years the court let all of them go. In almost all of them, somebody also did the right thing without being asked, which gets far less attention. 2 flight attendants over Georgia had the cabin ready from the moment the engines quit, with nothing coming from the cockpit, and investigators wrote that the toll would have been higher without them. Fishermen at Terra took their boats out into the dark off Palermo, and 21 people came out of that water alive. Every one of them has a report behind it running to hundreds of pages, and we go through them one at a time. Subscribe to Terra Obscura, and we will see you in the next one.